Welcome to the last session of the day. We have a really great panel talking about domestic politics in the U.S. As you see in the panel description, I would like to focus the conversation today on the second half, how cleavages in Washington will impact U.S. foreign policy and the role of U.S. As a global actor, particularly in U.S.-China competition. We have a fantastic panel, so let's dive right in. I will pose some questions to my panelists. We'll keep it conversational. And after the first round of input, I'll open for a Q&A and hearing from all of you around the table. So I hope we have a engaged and lively conversation. Let's start with Rachel. Rachel, you have, we'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about domestic politics, particularly after the midterm elections in the US with the GOP taking control of the House. Can you talk to us about what the landscape in Washington looks like today? What can we expect leading up to 2024? Would it be deadlocked? Would it be, how do you see that playing out? And then I'd like to talk to you about what are the fault lines that you see emerging within the two parties. But let's start first with laying down the landscape for our guests here.
Sure. Good, this is on. First of all, thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone for joining us so late in the evening. So first, to answer that question, I think just by starting off, Biden has had a good couple of years. With the Inflation Reduction Act, which I understand there are some Europeans in the room, that's not popular in Europe, so I understand that, but it's popular in the United States. The CHIPS Act, Ukraine support, potential student loan forgiveness, which is really important for people like me. But I think that even when you take this at face value, there was still this overwhelming sense that the 2022 midterms were going to be a total bloodbath, a red wave, as people named it. And as we saw what happened, that didn't occur for, I think, only just the third time in history. Biden was able to hold on to the Senate. He lost the House. Usually what happens with incumbent presidents is they either come into office with a majority and lose it. And Biden had a much more impressive showing than we expected. So that's really good news. At the same time, the support for Ukraine didn't become part of the foreign policy rhetoric in the lead up to the 2022 midterms like we thought it would. There was this real fear amongst both parties, I would say, but particularly the Democrats, that as time went on, Ukraine support amongst Americans would start to wane, and that different candidates would start discussing this and pushing back against so-called blank checks. And we didn't really see that take hold either. But what we are seeing is a real sense of fracturing, I think, not in between the Democrats and Republicans, but within these parties themselves. And I think that's much more prevalent in the Republican Party today than it is in the Democratic Party. I do think that the sense that the Republican Party is really divided down different approaches on foreign policy is a little bit overblown. But it's really interesting to hear how different leaders in the party are able to talk about this. You had Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who was at the Munich Security Conference a couple weeks ago, talking about how the reports that the Republican Party wants to withdraw from the world are much more overblown and overstated than in reality. You won't hear Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the Speaker of the House, say that, given we just saw what a mess it was when he barely made his election as the new speaker, and is really governing on a very thin majority. And he's sort of at the mercy of this very small but very loud group of right-wing provocateurs in the right-wing or in the Republican Party. And so I think what's going to be interesting is looking into the 2024 presidential election, how this might end up translating into the Republican Party in the lead up to the presidential election. So we're not exactly sure what this is going to look like yet. We have Nikki Haley, who has announced her candidacy, Donald Trump, who has announced his candidacy. We're all waiting to see what's going to happen with say Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo. There's a very good sense that we could have a pretty broad group of Republicans running for the presidency, and we're not exactly sure how that the foreign policy is going to play out. But what we do see is that oftentimes conversations about foreign policy are spoken about in terms of how they affect us domestically in the United States. So with Trump, you saw America first. With Biden, you saw foreign policy for the middle class. And we're not exactly sure how that's gonna play out going forward here. But it's going to be interesting. I think that the reports of widespread discontent in terms of U.S. support for Ukraine are overblown, and I don't think that that's something we have to worry about yet. But as this war drags on, I think we do run the risk of this becoming a much more partisan issue than it otherwise has been, and so that's something that I'll be watching really closely.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I know it's difficult to predict election results. Most people try to stay away from it. But if you were to make a prediction for 2024, where do you see that going?
If who wins in 2024? Yeah. Well, I think if the 2022 midterms did one thing, it was convince President Biden that he should absolutely run for president again. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. And it would be very surprising to me if he wasn't able to pull off a second term. Great. And I'm not just saying that as a Democrat. I'm saying that just as a totally unbiased scholar.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, staying on the issue of Ukraine and transatlantic ties, Leslie, let me come to you. Do you see? I mean, Rachel said that Ukraine has had sort of bipartisan support. Do you see any cleavages between the Democrats and Republicans when it comes to support for Ukraine in the long term, and for transatlantic ties? What should Europe worry about in case Republicans take the White House in 2024? According to Rachel, they won't. But what should they worry about? I mean, give us a sense of, on transatlantic ties in Ukraine. Do you see any cleavages between the two parties?
Yeah, happy to do that. I wrote up in the last 5 minutes notes on China, but I'd love to talk about Russia-Ukraine. I guess, a couple of things on the domestic question and then on the transatlantic question. Until recently, I was sort of with Rachel on as we all know, the domestic support for what Congress and the president and the White House more broadly have done to support Ukraine has been quite extraordinary. As Kamala Harris, the U.S. Vice President, well known to everybody here, said at Munich, there are places in America that you have never heard of, probably that I have heard of and you have, because we're from the Midwest, if I remember right, different parts of it. Mm-hmm. But there are places in the U.S. that you will never have heard of that are flying the flag of Ukraine. And for whatever reason, you can make a number of arguments, some of which are more critical, that have to do with, a perception of they're like us, they look like us, they're white like us, or whatever it is. But for whatever reason, and I think there are multiple reasons, this has really grabbed the heartland of the United States and of Americans. And it's been reflected in over $100 billion being committed so far, not having been spent yet, but having been committed, and including that really big package that was passed in December to kind of, to Congress-proof spending on Ukraine through the next several months in anticipation of a Republican House. So maybe that gets to the next point, which is that in anticipation of a Republican House, what does that mean? And for the leadership of the key committees in the House are very pro support of Ukraine. They're quite hawkish. They're quite strong on security and defense. They're really, really transatlantically minded in the sense that they believe in the U.S. engaged in Europe leading, and they believe in NATO. And so, the leadership roles are actually, I think, something that for those people who think it's a good thing, and that's certainly something that isn't debated, but it's not debated at this level, but it probably should be and will be debated at other levels. But at the leadership level, it still looks okay. But there are, front page of, I think, the New York Times today, or yesterday, there was a big piece saying it's starting to look a little bit more uncertain. It's looking like there's some fracturing. It's looking like there is now a domestic debate about whether we should be putting all this money all the way over there. And here's the key, when there's no clear gains on the ground. And there was a great piece written for Chatham House by Bruce Stokes that kind of went back to Vietnam, went back to Afghanistan, went back to multiple wars, and showed over time, as wars go on, you lose. I mean, it's obvious, but it's empirically important to point out. You lose U.S. public support. And so part of what we've seen in the last several weeks has been a tremendous effort, especially around the 1-year mark, to drive momentum, to drive enthusiasm, to drive visibility. Biden's visit, of course. But part of the reason that that's happening is because there's a clear awareness that this is about to get extremely tough. It's going to be very hard to demonstrate so-called success. And as, electoral politics come to the foreground, which they are about to in the U.S., primary season and all the rest of it, this is going to become heavily debated. And the president, because it has been his flagship security policy and success, is going to come under pressure. Second thing that's going to happen, and this goes to your transatlantic point, is that there are going to be Republicans who stand up and say, well, what is Europe doing? Yeah, that actually hasn't really happened yet. Not really. It's about to happen. What is Europe doing? We've spent over $100 billion. We still, if you saw in the papers, I think it was today or yesterday again, manufacturing continues to drop. Trump's base, the Republican base, the base that everybody's fighting for, the numbers are showing, yes, jobs are going up, but manufacturing capacity in the U.S. is going down. All these things are going to get linked in the narrative in the primaries. And so what could well happen is, you're not looking after us. Europe is not quite doing what it should do. Germany, you're not quite spending what you said you would spend. And we're not seeing the successes on the ground. So I think that it's possible that this could actually become a very significant issue and that we could be in a very, very different place in 6 to 9 months. I hope that we're not. And that's setting aside, in some ways, the much more significant and much more important conversation that's politically extremely difficult to have in the U.S., which is about what is the end game, what are the goals, what does it look like, and nobody, self-consciously, people know that they're not having, people in high levels of office know they're not having this conversation in public. They're not about to have it right now in public. They probably are having it in private, and they're not about to tell us about it.
Yeah, I think the Biden administration has been very patient with, say, countries like Germany. I wonder if that would run out even among the Democrats at some point, not just the Republicans. But we can come back to some of those questions. I'll also ask your opinion on China, but I wanted to go to Dhruva first. Dhruva, the Biden administration has taken a very specific approach to China, systemic competition, focusing on economic measures, technology measures, strengthening the networks of partners and allies. Is there bipartisan support for this approach and generally on how to deal with the China question?
So thank you, Garima. I'll try and just provide a couple of thoughts that just to sort of frame the question in some ways before getting specifically to China. And I speak as somebody who, I like to think has a sort of inside-outside kind of view on Washington politics. I've sort of been in and out, both physically and of Washington for 18 years now. I'm dating myself. But and I guess the first premise is the U.S. all that polarized at all? or another way of thinking about it is, has the U.S. ever been not polarized? There was a thing called the Civil War. There was the Vietnam War. The Iraq wars were very. I was in D.C. for much of the Iraq wars, and it was a very divisive period. So in some ways, it's superficially, I just want to question the very basic premise that the U.S. is in a very divided space. Some things I do think it's fair to point out have changed. One, the media environment has really changed. So today it's not just people's opinions that are being debated, it's sometimes basic facts, and it's quite clear Republicans, Democrats, people depending on their political inclination, are getting very, very different sources of basic information. That has fundamentally changed. It's not unique to the US, but it's happening there too. Secondly, I think you are seeing a sort of identity politics that came to the fore, particularly during Trump's election, that of a kind that the US hadn't seen, at least in recent living memory, and which is here with us to stay. And these are sort of real cleavages along, to some degree, racial lines, but urban versus rural, college-educated people versus non-college educated people, age, different generations, and to some degree, gender as well. And these are really sort of lightning rod issues that are dividing the United States. And these are really, insofar as there is polarization affecting foreign policy, it's reflected through these lenses, not necessarily the issues. When it comes to the big foreign policy issues, though, again, there is sometimes more consensus than there is divisions on burden sharing. The Obama administration asked for NATO allies to increase their defense spending to 2%. They asked very nicely. Trump asked the same thing, just not nicely at all. Biden is back to asking that in a much more nice way and saying, we will certainly do our bit to lead from the front. Military interventions, I think there's a bipartisan consensus now that open-ended military interventions by the United States are a bad idea. Does that mean that the U.S. will never do it again? No, but they certainly will be thinking twice about it. And we saw that with the decline in, from the drawdown in Iraq that started under the Obama administration, continued through the Trump administration from Afghanistan, and then finally the Biden administration decision last year to withdraw completely from Afghanistan. Trade and jobs. Today there is a bipartisan consensus that free trade, open-ended free trade agreements where the U.S., which would increase the deficit, the U.S. deficit, and come at the risk of American jobs is a bad idea. And I think there's a broad bipartisan consensus about that. Again, it'll manifest itself in different ways. But as a result, there's also now a bipartisan consensus broadly on some aspects of industrial policy. And we see that with the CHIPS Act, with the IRA, and others. So on many of these issues, in fact, there's more consensus. I'd say two broad foreign policy issues, though, remain quite divided. One is climate change, which is, in a clear splits. In some areas, actually, there is, again, in real terms, it doesn't change all that much because the U.S. is still, the Republican Party is still interested in energy exports, both fossil fuel and renewables. In fact, Republican states are probably going to be amongst the major beneficiaries of the IRA. Another big polarizing issue is immigration, where there is some fundamental different starting points. But again, on many of the other issues I laid out, I think there's a broader consensus than is sometimes perceived. Which brings me again to China. China has, for some of the reasons I outlined, become an area of broad bipartisan consensus. We had a U.S. special committee that has now been set up, a bipartisan committee. They had their first hearings a little while ago in the House. Sometimes it's different priorities on the left and the right, but they reach similar conclusions. So for the left, for example, human rights and Xinjiang are bigger issues. For the right, Taiwan sometimes, although that's now becoming more of a bipartisan issue with Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Jobs, the concerns about industrial theft, concerns about digital competition. With China. So in many ways, again, if you were to lay out what is a broad right Republican Party foreign policy outlook look like, and how does it approach China, and what does a broad sort of centrist Democrat foreign policy outlook look like, and how does it approach China, they actually meet in a very similar place, even though if they come from, the starting points are very different. The big gap, and this would be my final point, I would say on China, is less between Republicans and Democrats today. It's between DC and New York. It's between the foreign policy and national security community in DC and the finance and economic and business community based primarily in New York. And this divide is still quite strong. We saw this in the reaction to China's reopening at the World Economic Forum that was announced, and particularly the business community's reaction to that. So bridging that gap is still going to be a difficulty, no matter what party is in power in the United States. One big change over the last 5 or so years has been that Silicon Valley, broadly, and I know there's some people around the table from Silicon Valley companies, my sense is, has broadly moved from a position that was closer to New York 5 years ago to today closer to Washington. And that's been a shift. Another interesting, although more minor shift, has been Hollywood, which again was still, and I would say, still broadly closer to New York, but with Top Gun Maverick has now started to drift slowly towards DC. So in the sense that it was the first time that a Hollywood movie was shown to be successful, commercially successful, without relying on the Chinese market or fears of not being able to enter into the Chinese market. So I think the broad takeaway I'd say is I think we are moving to a place where the U.S. National security and foreign policy community, no matter the party, does have a great deal of consensus on China, but there are certainly internal divisions that will have to be overcome.
Thanks, Dhruva. That was really great. Thank you for giving us a different perspective about divisions, not just within parties, but actually consensus on many issues. Paul, let me come to you on that question. I'll talk to you about India later. But within the Republicans, where do you see cleavages on foreign policy questions?
So thanks for the question. So I think the division, the real foreign policy division, is actually in the Republican Party. I think much more so than within the Democratic Party. I think there's, if you think about two big national security concerns right now, or strategic concerns, Russia on the one hand and China on the other, I think there's pretty broad consensus amongst everybody, Republicans within their own party and between Republicans and Democrats on China, on the dangers of rising Chinese power and authoritarian Chinese behavior in the Indo-Pacific, and the need to keep it free and open, and the need to cooperate with a country like India very closely to ensure that the region is not sort of dominated by Chinese authoritarianism. Where there's more of a split is on the Russia question, I think. And Russia, the split is really, I think, within the Republican Party. And there are kind of two broad factions within the party. There's sort of an older, more traditional subset of Republicans, and then there's a newer kind of sort of Trump-inspired, perhaps, America First. I don't know what you want to call them, whatever label you want to use, but it's something that's really come to the fore since Trump and the Trump phenomenon. And that part of the Republican Party says, and Dhruva was referring to this, is that there's class cleavages, educational cleavages, and that result in kind of a just broad philosophical differences in broad philosophical outlook. And on the Russia question, I think the more kind of America First Trump wing or faction or subset of the party, whatever you want to say, is a lot more skeptical on Russia, and wants to say, well, show us why this is in the interest of ordinary Americans who will be footing the bill for this, right? Who are paying the taxes, who also disproportionately serve in the military and would pay the price of any kind of hot conflict that happened. And they're the ones in this narrative, and I think there's some fairness in this. They're the ones who actually paid a lot of the price for the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars. They're the ones who fought, and they live in places that are kind of ignored by coastal elites, and they pay the taxes, and just like everybody else. So they need to be heard, and we're going to ask questions about projects like Russia, projects like standing up to Ukraine. We want to know why it is in the interest of ordinary Americans, and you see this happening now. I think that, we don't know who's going to win the presidential election, hard to say. If Republicans do win, though, the impact on U.S. strategy is really going to depend on which Republican wins, right? So if you have a more traditional Republican, say a Nikki Haley, maybe a Mike Pompeo, I think that broad bipartisan consensus remains, and America remains engaged not just on China, but also on Ukraine and Russia. If you get somebody else, perhaps a Ron DeSantis, now he hasn't announced, but he's been, the speculation is that he will run, and he's seems to be in a pretty strong position in a lot of ways, very popular in Florida. We'll see if he can translate that out nationally. But he's recently made some noises that are skeptical of the Ukraine project, saying that, I don't think Ukraine should have a blank check. We need to be very careful about what we're doing there. So that sort of, I think, foreshadows a more, America first kind of approach. So it will really depend on which Republican wins, if the Republicans do win. But if you have sort of a more traditional Republican president, or if the Democrats win, I think pretty much business as usual. If not, Russia's more up in the air. Ukraine's more up in the air.
Thanks, Paul. A quick question on India. Usually, of course, there's bipartisan consensus for support for ties with India. Has India's position on Ukraine, relationship with Russia, raised any questions at all, or not really?
Yeah, so again, I think that the India relationship is something that's been remarkably bipartisan going back to the George W. Bush administration, the civil nuclear deal. So through Republican and Democrat administrations, and the Biden administration is no exception. I think they are committed to the notion that close partnership with India to check rising Chinese power and keep the Indo-Pacific free and open, that is a central strategic imperative. So cooperation with India, very important. That said, I think there has been real heartburn over India's reaction to Ukraine and its relationship with Russia, refusal to condemn Russia's war in Ukraine, and also taking advantage of the situation to get cheap oil, right? So this created some tension, and you saw public spats actually between India and the United States, with U.S. leaders publicly saying things like, there's going to be a cost if India keeps doing this. Indian leaders coming back and saying, well, we're going to pursue our interests as we see fit, and we're not going to be sort of dictated to by anybody. The rhetoric has toned down. Recently, Treasury Secretary Yellen was out in India, actually, and she said that she hopes India will be able to get cheap oil under the price cap. So, I think, the U.S. has come around a bit, and the Indians have also been a little bit more forthcoming about saying, both commentators and political leaders as well, saying that, they recognize that they're going to have to wean themselves off of Russia. I think they do recognize that. I think that was already happening, actually. In recent years, Indian imports of Russian material had actually been going down. But so I think the rhetoric and the heartburn is, it's sort of cooling off. And the reality is that the strategic imperative for cooperation between the two countries is just too strong to be derailed by a disagreement like this. That said, it creates headwinds, and it feeds into negative narratives on both sides. On the U.S. side, the idea that, India is never really going to come around. They're never really going to step up and be our partner, and they're always going to pursue their interests in a kind of very narrow, self-interested way. And for India, the idea that the U.S. is a bit of a bully, pushes its weight around, kind of tells other countries what they should do, is not sensitive, perhaps, to India's strategic interests. So, that's unhelpful. I think it can slow cooperation, but it's not going to, again, given the security imperative here, I don't think it's going to really fundamentally derail anything. These kinds of issues, disagreements on Ukraine, also human rights issues, they put sand in the gears for sure, especially with the Congress, more so than with the executive, I think. They're more attuned to some of these issues, and they also just are, they're not responsible for security in the same way that the executive is. So, but for the administration, the security imperatives, I think, will be overriding, and we'll see continued progress.
Thank you, Paul. Now we come to our final speaker, Mariam. after which I'll open for Q&A to the audience. Mariam, Afghanistan is an important issue that's always brought up here at the Raisina Dialogue as well, and I'm glad that you're here on this panel. So let's hear your perspective, sort of going a little bit away from all the topics that we've dealt so far, but a very important issue nonetheless. With Trump's Doha deal and the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's been ample criticism of both parties and their approaches. How do you see U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, but also looking forward, what do you expect from U.S. and other partners, particularly in terms of support for Afghan women and girls?
Thank you. I'd like to point out that United States foreign policy falls under the conference's theme, provocation, uncertainty, and turbulence. It's the third anniversary of the Doha Agreement. The agreement addressed 4 issues: reducing violence, withdrawing foreign troops, starting the intra-Afghan negotiation, which was a key element that didn't take place, and guaranteeing that Afghanistan won't become a refuge for terrorists. The Doha Agreement was essentially a troop withdrawal that was sold as a peace agreement by Democrats and Republicans. In the early 21st centuries, U.S. seemed to play guardian or custodians of democracy in foreign nations that are merely not similar to theirs. The lack of understanding of culture, religion, societal norms engineered the current circumstances of Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, and others. Few clear, dangerous guardianship acts regarding Afghanistan is the exclusion of the Taliban from the Bonn Conference in 2001 under the Bush administration. In 2014, Obama administration took the lead on brokering an agreement tied to an election battle between Abdullah and Ghani, and ultimately the National Unity Government was formed only because Ghani was favored by the United States. The Trump administration engaged in direct negotiation with the Taliban in Doha, excluding the Afghan government. I could go into details of what the U.S. did wrong, but I really want to focus on solutions going forward. Crisis Group has recently published a few recommendations that I would like to echo. No military intervention is needed in Afghanistan. U.S. officials believe imposing aid cuts or deeper isolation is a way to corner the Taliban. However, the Taliban are not fazed by this. This group has lived in isolations for 20 plus years, and if you put them in that place again, they're willing to do so, especially when they're in power. U.S., from their perspective, believe that they are productive, but in reality, it's wrong to lead a society into famine. International organizations should fund humanitarian appeals, monitor aid distribution carefully, and transparency is key here. Also use soft mechanisms for some sort of flexibility with the Taliban, in addition to long-term social change policies through aid and support programs. Taliban's subjugation of women should not provoke international reprisals that exacerbate their suffering. Afghanistan should be a functional society for people, not to be forced into terrorist organizations again. The central bank function is key for economic stability in the future, and without economic safety, the pressure of disparity will mostly be placed on women. Electrical grids are key to keeping people, especially women of Afghanistan, connected to the world, and supporting their irrigation system will make them self-sustainable. Distancing Afghanistan will not only not help the Afghan people, the region, or the world community, it will destroy society in one way. I know that we're talking about Ukraine, but it's really interesting to see the dynamics and how people respond to Afghanistan and Ukraine, especially with what you had mentioned earlier. Right now, the Taliban have sent diplomats to Tehran, Istanbul, Ankara. Supposedly, they're on their way to Dubai, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Malaysia, and 1 or 2 other countries. Yeah, and yesterday, the Taliban defense minister called on India to train their soldiers. So the main diplomatic objective of the Taliban leadership is to gain relief from sanctions and obtain official recognition, especially from the United States. I doubt this will happen anytime soon, but there are and will continue to be back-channel diplomacy. So if there's anything else, we can discuss further.
Great. Thank you, Mariam. We have about 10 minutes in this session, so I'd like to open for Q&A. Please raise your hand. I already see. Let's collect a few questions. I'll start from Reinhard, please.
Thank you, Garima. Thanks to all the panelists for their very proficient input. I have 2 questions regarding the Republican Party. One is, I hear that some of the would-be candidates for the presidential primaries might be interested in pushing Taiwan independence narrative. How much is that a reality, and what are the prospects? Second, I also hear that among some in the Republican Party, there is a rethinking about U.S. trade policy, the abandonment of TPP and all that, and that there are some pushing towards reviving a proactive engagement, in particular with the Indo-Pacific, clearly going beyond IPEF. How realistic is that? Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Fyodor Voitolovsky. I'm from Russia, Russian Academy of Sciences. I would like to say that I'm very grateful to all panelists. I'm very glad to see my old friend Paul Kapoor, who I know for many years. And I have a question concerning Ukraine. Since since Ukrainian case has become the issue on which both parties are having consensus, it's among very, very narrow group of issues on which both parties are having close positions. If situation in Ukraine will change in a very dramatic way, which is different from American conventional and Western conventional vision of development of Ukrainian crisis. For example, Russia's attacks will be more successful. Russia will go further in Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian resources, economic forces of the society and military resources would be exhausted, and it would happen before presidential election. How can this scenario have impact on 2024 presidential elections? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on this row? Okay, I'll come to you. I do have your Tanvi first, and then the gentleman here.
Thank you. Tanvi Madan from Brookings. A couple of quick questions. One to the Midwesterners on the panel, Leslie and Rachel. One of the things that strikes me, in 1992, we had a president going up, George H.W. Bush, who was considered to be one of the most successful foreign policy presidents and lost on kind of domestic issues. And I'm struck by the fact that when President Biden was in Kyiv, a lot of praise from the foreign policy community in the US, a lot of praise from the Europeans. But if you looked at a lot of the domestic coverage, it was about him not going to East Palestine, Ohio. And the Republicans bringing that up, former President Trump going there. Are we going to see more of this in terms of, and I think Paul actually suggested that as well, in terms of why are we spending money abroad? And I think the mayor of East Palestine, Ohio, said that. Why are we spending so much money there, not at home? Do you see these attacks and criticisms as sticking? And the second question, and perhaps Paul, because maybe to you or maybe to Dhruva as well, this question of European theater versus, and you can contest my framing, but we do see this where you're seeing people say, especially on the Republican side, that this is a question of needing to emphasize the Indo-Pacific theater, not the European theater. That there is a balance that needs to be struck, and it's the wrong balance that is being struck. Are you seeing this as something that could potentially be a reason for people to say, let's do less in Ukraine, more in Asia?
Oh, thank you. See, we the Indians are delighted and proud and excited to have CAM in the administration. And my question is that the contribution of healthcare reforms, as a diabetic, we are so happy that insulin is affordable. Do you think that this kind of gestures will win the hearts and minds of the electorate and influence the election, so that in the 2024 you will come back here as a democratic administration, and health of wealth for the POTUS and Vice President? Thank you.
Okay. If you keep your question very quick, then I can take it.
Sviatoslav Jurash, the youngest ever member of parliament of Ukraine. My question is about China and basically the evolution of policies on China, especially now with Biden office and the lessons you learn from what's happening in Ukraine.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. wide range of questions. Paul, is it okay if we start with you and then go down the panel? Because I think you had most of the questions were directed over to you. Starting with, I think, Taiwan.
Okay, sure. Where was the Taiwan question? Yeah, so I don't have any inside information that that's something that's being considered. You know, a view that, or the idea that certain Republicans might push for Taiwan independence. I haven't heard that. I think it would be not a smart thing to do. Because I think that the U.S. has its hands full even at the moment, just with the level of challenge that they're getting from China in the Indo-Pacific right now. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a war going on in Europe, and stoking sort of poking China in the eye by doing something like that, I think would be a reckless thing to do personally. And I haven't heard that that's something that people are seriously considering, but maybe I just am not privy to that. On trade policy, yeah. So this is one of the sort of principles that came out of the Trump era, right? Was that free trade is a good thing, but it's not an end in itself, and it actually hurts some people. And those people don't have a voice often, and so we need to think about some kind of trade policy, industrial policy, something that affords them some degree of protection, and doesn't allow and doesn't make us vulnerable in a number of ways, perhaps being exploited in terms of unfair trade agreements, also in terms of security, right? So a lot of the concern that you see about supply chains. This is going to lead to a reining in, I think, in some areas at least, of free trade and sort of control over how those components of various parts of, let's say, national security related products, weapons, whatever they might be, high tech, how those things. How they're going to be controlled, how the trade is going to be controlled there. So I think there's a move to rein in free trade to some degree, and there's not really an appetite for a free trade agreement in the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, or even a bilateral one with India. There'd be a lot to be gained through a free trade regime with India. And the trade numbers on the one hand look good, but they're nowhere near where they could be if we had an agreement. But there's not really an appetite in either country for that kind of a move. So I think that's going to continue to be a problem. What else what other questions did I get here on Russia? I wouldn't say that there's a consensus on Russia. I mean, I actually think that that's where there's more of a divide. I think there's a there's a consensus on China. I think the Democrats are united on it, Republicans are united within their party, and between the two of them, they see the China problem very similarly. But the Russia problem is different, and I think that, as I said in my comments earlier, I think the sort of more traditional Republicans are closer to where the Democrats are, which is that we need to stand up to Russia because we don't want, and this is the argument at least, right? That we don't want the principle to go unchallenged that you can, when you have a disagreement over boundaries, you change them by force. We also want to side with a more liberal country in what is seen as an emerging battle between sort of authoritarian power blocks and a more countries that share a more liberal vision for the future. And then also, frankly, an opportunity to attrit Russian resources in this. So I think that is where the Democrats are. I think that's where the traditional Republicans are. But the more America first, or sort of more Trump-oriented Republicans are going to say, why are we doing this? Why are we spending this money? We want to know how it's going to benefit ordinary Americans. And I think the support there is going to be softer. And that's why it does matter sort of who wins the presidential election. If the Dems win, as I said before, I think things don't change. Traditional Republicans win similarly, but if you get somebody like a DeSantis or somebody along those lines, you could see some softening of support there.
I'll just answer one question coming from sort of the Midwest, from Salt Lake City, Utah, where what you said is right. There are Ukraine flags all over my very suburban neighborhood full of families, and they've been that way for a year. And I find that really interesting and heartening. One thing I think Biden has done very well is maintain this Western unity over the last year. One thing he has not done as well is message these war aims to the American people. And that's where I think we're beginning to see some daylight. And that's where when you have Biden go visit Poland for the second time in a year, go visit Ukraine for the 1-year anniversary of the invasion, while at the same time there's been this big train derailment in East Palestine, it leaves openings for his political opponents to come in and say, look, we're for America. Biden is for this thing he's protecting overseas, which is the liberal international order, which doesn't really resonate for a lot of Americans. You know, this isn't our war. We're protecting this sort of nebulous idea that has been coined by the United States, and that's a very hard thing to sell in and of itself. It's even harder to sell when the aims of the support of the United States aren't clear, and I don't think they are right now. So I think that's something that Biden can probably do better going forward, and that's something that he should expect to be, I think, attacked on, especially from the right as we head into the 2024 election. So I think we'll see how that changes over the next few months or 6 months or a year as this continues to grind on. But I would expect those attacks to become even greater.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. One is, I guess at a sort of first order level, you know, it's not, I guess it's sort of a response to Paul, but it speaks to some of the questions, which is, you know, I completely agree with your evaluation of the different strands of the Republican Party. But what that means, I think, is maybe, and I'm not saying you would disagree, but it means a couple of things that I would add. One is that it's not just that you get two different views, it's that having two very vocal views shifts the entire debate. Because if you have part of the Republican Party that emerges and says, why are we spending money, we shouldn't do this, et cetera, or on the China question says, let's move to strategic clarity, not strategic ambiguity, which is edging towards, you know, more support of, and which kind of starts to look like supporting independence. It doesn't just affect, it's not just about whether they get elected or not, it's that it puts pressure on other candidates to shore that up. And we've seen this in America, and we've seen this in politics all over the world. It moves the entire debate, potentially. That's a very dynamic process, but it's one that's likely to happen. Second point kind of contradicts that, which is that what people say on the campaign trail isn't, and we saw this with Trump, it's not really what they do. And whether that's because, you know, if elected, you become conservative and you recognize that America has interests and partners and a need for stability, or if it's because you believe in, you know, either serious bureaucrats or the deep state, depending on your political view. But so in other words, I would caution against reading future U.S. foreign policy off of stated positions of any particular branch. I think it's a much more complex process. The other thing I wanted to speak to is the trade question, which I think is a really interesting one. And, you know, I would agree with the consensus view, which is that, you know, the U.S., for so many reasons, Congress, the electorate, certain segments of the U.S. population having a disproportionate voice that have lost out from trade, et cetera, et cetera. However, and here's the thing I wanted to add, I actually think that there is still a lot of enthusiasm amongst the political classes and the bureaucratic classes and the elites that are just biding their time and hoping and waiting that they can do some version of free trade again, with more negotiation, with more, you know, protections of workers and all the rest of it. But I think people really want to get back there for multiple reasons. Faith, ideology, but also, you know, fighting the good fight in a serious, multidimensional way in the Indo-Pacific. And, you know, as an anecdote, I'd say the fact that Council on Foreign Relations just appointed Michael Froman, I just went, yeah, CFR is like waiting for the moment when the TPP or the CTPPP and U.S. trade policy can come right back, and they're going to be, you know, maybe thinking in a 2022, 24 way about it, but they're not giving up on the U.S. having a very serious economic strategy that takes account of geopolitics as well. But I think it's still there. Final point on China. I actually think there's more division than we attribute. I think that the you know, the Republicans and certainly part of the Republican Party, Pompeo, et cetera, were far more ideological, much more about the Chinese Communist Party, much more ready to kind of push a less pragmatic view of how to take a hard line on China, and and that could also push the entire debate on China in a direction that's not actually resonant with the language in the national security strategy, which says we are not seeking to change China, we're seeking to change the universe or the region in which it operates, the rules. And that was not really, in my estimation, the view of the previous administration in its last iterations. So I don't know. I see there as being some significant potential ideological divisions.
We are a few minutes over time, and I don't want to be scolded by Samir. So, Dhruva, the last point, the final closing remarks.
I'll be very quick. On the trade issue that Butikova mentioned, in the U.S. for a trade, you need basically congressional approval for a trade agreement, particularly one involving lower tariffs, and that I suspect even if you have a presidency, Republican or Democrat, that is in favor of free trade, that at this point of time, it's almost impossible to get that. The one exception, and this actually gets to a point Leslie alluded to, is you did, for example, recently have the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0, which did pass at that time a Democrat majority House. It was pushed by Trump, Republican president. In the middle of him being impeached, suddenly there's this bipartisan consensus on a trade agreement. So that could be a blueprint for potentially. Now, the key elements of that is it blocked the trade partners, Mexico and Canada, from entering into trade agreements with non-market economies, China. So that's something, for example, that would be on the table. It would have stronger workers, labor regulations and things like that, to basically be seen as creating a more even playing field for U.S. manufacturing. So, will partners? The question I think is, will partners in the Indo-Pacific be willing to countenance a trade agreement along those lines, USMCA lines? So that would be worth it. To Tanvi's point, very quickly. I'm worried about some conversations I've had with staff and members who are mainstream internationalist Republicans, who say, yes, we are approving another military aid package to Ukraine, but every time we do it, we are conscious that this is equivalent to our entire state's budget. And so all I'm saying, it's not that they will stop approving it, but every successive package will be harder to pass, and the longer the war draws out. This year might be fine, but 2, 3, 4 years, it will be harder, even for people who are very sympathetic to Ukraine in Congress, to continue passing that, particularly at large amounts. So the two comments.
Mariam, do you have any final comments?
No, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking my wonderful panelists.